So we extracted the color div to its own function, but we're still building all the LIs and the list itself right here inside handle submit. And besides making this a really long function, this is awfully redundant. We're repeating ourselves. We're doing the same thing over and over. So let's see if we can avoid that. What if we had a function that generated list items that follow this basic format? We're programmers. We can make it happen if we want to. Function. How about render list item? What do we need to know from the outside in order to make just one list item? Let's concentrate on building just one. We need to know the label for it, right? And we need to know the value. So let's take two arguments, label and value. And then it needs to do something kind of like this. So let's just take this and modify it. So we'll make an item. We're going to create an element that is an LI. We're going to set its text content to whatever that label we passed in is, colon, whatever that value we passed in is. Make sense? And then don't forget to return it. Pretty simple. Let's test that by itself. Let's not worry about how it fits into the bigger picture. Let's just make sure this function works. Make sure I refresh the page since I saved. Render list item. Label. Sure. Dog breed. Value. Corgi. LI, dog breed, Corgi. Make sense? Understand how this function works? Could have written it yourself. Now we just need to get it so that it calls that over and over with the right combination of label and value. I suppose we don't need these anymore. We're going to do the same thing. We just don't know how yet. We should probably also have a function that creates the list itself. Let's make it function render list. We know it's going to make an element that is a UL. And it's going to return it eventually. And somehow it needs to call render list item several times. So what do we need from the outside world in order to render this list correctly? We need all the labels and values, right? You may have encountered in your studies a data structure that basically holds a list of labels and values. An object in JavaScript, a hash in some languages, a map in others, an associative array in PHP. We've dealt with those, right? Something like this. Const foo equals name blah age blah. Something like that. You've seen these. Had to do them in Code Wars. So without worrying about how we're actually going to build this thing for real, Let's just hard code an object. We'll call it person. Curly braces denoting an object literal. And it's a bunch of key value pairs. Key, colon, value. So name, colon, who we got? Sorry, called on her a lot, but I haven't typed her name today. Favorite color. What is it?
Can I say black?
Sure. How about, what's that really dark gray that has kind of an amusing name? I don't know. Oh, well. Age. Confidential. Confidential. Since we're not using the input, we can cheat like that. Now, hey, guess what? You can put the trailing comma there, even without another property underneath it. Afterneath. Neither after nor underneath it. That may offend your sensibilities, a comma with nothing after it, but it's actually kind of handy that you can do this for a couple of reasons. One, when you come back and add another one later, you don't have to remember to put the comma there. Just get in the habit of putting it there every single time. Furthermore, if you're going through the Git history and looking at the difference between each commit, it'll show that as having changed both lines if you add the comma later. And it just clutters up your history, makes it harder to read, and it actually makes that commit slightly larger. So I like leaving the trailing comma in. So let's do it. All right, so we've got this person. So maybe renderList creates an object that takes that basic shape. We'll call it person data. And down here, let's just wish that we could. I'm going to get rid of that commented out stuff right now. That we could just append renderList person. How do we make it work? Basically, inside here, I need to loop over that thing, right? And call renderList item for every pair of things, every key value pair. You probably did something similar in solving the mirror object problem on Code Wars. Do you remember that? How'd you do it? How'd you loop over all the things in an object? A little different from an array. Ooh, she used for in. That's some new fanciness. Anybody else have a different way they did it? It's actually a pretty easy way to do it. It is not, however, the way I showed the morning class. So I'm going to show you a different way. But that's a good solution. Who did it a different way? Somebody did it a different way. No? So to loop over these, what if I could get an array containing just the keys out of this object? I can, using Object.keys, which was around in ES5, I believe. For in is, I think, is it for in or for of that's newer? I can't remember anymore. For of is new, right? Object.keys, if we call that on an object, that would give us an array of name, favorite color, age. So it gives us just the keys out of that object. So then with an array, we can loop kind of the way that we're used to. Or we could learn another way to do it. It's always excited about this. Who's heard of map? Anybody heard of map? Have you used map in any language? She has. She's excited about this plan, and she even kind of knows what we're going to do. What's map? What am I talking about? Okay, that's a different thing, but that is the same word. So, perfectly valid answer. The method map on an array, this is present in quite a few languages. The short version is, it does the same thing to every item in the array. If we go out and look at the documentation, this is the first Google result for JavaScript Array Map. This is MDM, Mozilla Developer Network. This is, for all intents and purposes, the official documentation for JavaScript and the DOM. The map method creates a new array with the results of calling a provided function on every element in this array. I might take a moment to unpack that definition. Okay, it calls a provided function on every element in this array. So it does the same thing to everything in the array. And that's what we need to happen. Now it also happens to create a new array with the results, but we just won't do anything with the return value. So the fact that it does that is immaterial for our purposes. So we have an array now. Object.keys returns an array that looks like this. So we can call map. Parameters to map. Callback, a function. When we pass a function to another function as an argument, we often call that a callback. Function that produces an element of the new array taking 3 arguments. Here's the point. This function will get called on everything in the array. We can pretend it doesn't take 3 arguments because, as we learned, JavaScript doesn't enforce that kind of thing. We can just use one of them. So let's put a function inside here. And we'll just make an anonymous function. We can do that. We can just make a function right here in place. We could have done that down here too with add event listener. We could have said function blah blah blah. But we chose to make that a named function. We'll do it in line this time. Now that function we write will receive an argument. That argument will be each of the items in that array. This is what our array looks like. So each of those things is a label, right? So we'll just call it that. It's one of the keys from our original object. So what do we want to do now that we have it? We've made our UL. Now we need to make all of our LIs, right? So we want to call renderList item several times. So for each item in the array, let's call renderList item. RenderList item takes 2 arguments. First, the label. Well, hey, we've got that. And then the value. So the object is person data. We have the current label. How do we get the value at that key? Anybody else? Anybody want to fight her over it? Anybody even hear what she said? All right, take just a moment. So we have an object that looks something like this. Let's just pretend name is the only one. Oops. We have an array that has things like this in it. And now we've been given a string containing name. How do we get sorry out of data, given that we have a variable label that contains the string name? So there are two ways of accessing the properties of an object. One with a dot like this. We can do that if the key follows variable naming rules, basically. It doesn't have any spaces in it, doesn't have any dashes, anything like that. But remember, these keys are really just strings. But if we name them that way, we can leave the quotes off. So we can do it this way, or we could do it this way, just like an array. Except instead of a numerical index, it's a key as a string. So knowing that, and I have the string name in a label, what can I do to get sorry out of there? Yeah, we know you know. Anybody else? We saw that we could do it with data.name or data square bracket, the string name. We have the string name saved to a variable called label. But pretend we don't know that that's the string name. All we know is that this holds the key that we want out of our object. Say it, Tom. Data square bracket label. Make sense? That's the same thing as writing data the string name, right? Because label is the string name, which we've established is how you get stuff out of an object. One of the two ways. Dig it? So knowing that, render list item takes the label and the value, so the value out of that person data object. So we could call person data square bracket label. Where did label come from magically? It came from this array. Object keys returned an array containing this right here. Map calls the same function on every item from that array. So it will call this function that we provided on the string name. It'll call it again on the string favorite color, and it'll call it again on the string age. The first time it does it, it'll call renderList item, passing in name and the actual name. Second time through, it'll pass in the string favorite color as well as the actual color. Ditto age. Make sense? So what we're actually doing here, you'll recall, we have this hard-coded person. So it doesn't matter what we put in the form right now. It's always going to do this person that we've hard-coded here. Whoops. Ah, cusses. Pardon my harsh language. Let's see what happens. Refresh. Go. Nothing happened whatsoever. Let's see. Render list, passed in person, render list, object keys, person data, map, function label, render list item. Oh yeah, I rendered the list items. A lot of good that did me. I didn't add them to the list. So I also need to say list append child. Let's make a little item here. So it called render list item 3 times. So then I had list items that I didn't do anything with. I need to add them to the list. Right? Try that again. And I get that. Now it's still just the string black right now, but we're not going to worry about that. Okay? Now instead of hard coding this, let's get it out of the form. So instead of just typing in sorry here, let's just use f.personname.value. It's the only time I'm going to use it, so I'm not going to bother saving it to a variable anymore. Let's do the same with favorite color. Let's do the same with age. So I create this object, build it out of the values from the form, pass that object into the list. We could go ahead and separate this to 2 lines if it's a little overwhelming. Const list equals renderList person. Then we append that list to details. So now it's pretty easy to read through handle submit and tell what it's doing. We don't know the details of how renderList works, but we get an idea of what it's doing. It's turning this object into a list. And if you look at renderList in isolation, it's creating a UL for every key inside person data. It's calling this function, which calls renderList item and appends, it appends that item to the list and returns the list. And then we append that list to the details div. Let's try it out. Name, Marshall. Favorite color, red. Age, 423. Looks pretty good for his age. Yay, favorite color. #FF0000, just like you said. It's working, but we're back to not having our color div. Nevertheless, it's been a really long time since we've committed, and we've made some serious progress in breaking this out into separate functions. So let's go ahead and commit that. Build the list in a separate function.